All right. So food justice. So we do two. We eventually I separated our food justice class into two sections. One is like kind of national and international. It's kind of like bigger picture. Well, like today we're going to talk about like the history going all the way back to colonialism and how our food justice system was kind of created, and in many ways it's still the same when it comes to exploitation and things like that. We're going to talk about different like farmers and different campaigns and workers' rights campaigns, restaurant workers. Talk all about environmental justice, animals. All like it's going to be kind of a crash course in a whole bunch of different topics because I mean like food justice, like the more you talk, you'll hear about food justice, the more you realize that it's a very big umbrella term. It's not just like like a lot of people try to like say, oh, it's a food desert, it's getting food to them. It's food, like food justice is like huge term. I mean, it has to do with food, and our food systems also has to do with housing justice, immigration justice, dismantling systems of oppression like white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and all these that you think it's a huge thing. So we're going to kind of do a quick crash course and just talk about kind of the history and talk about different things, different parts of it, on a large scale today. And then the next class, I separated the next class because the next class, the 201, is going to be very focused on DC. It's going to be focused on what we call food apartheids, which is like basically how did we get here? This isn't just a food issue. Like how did we, overlap? So we'll go through like the last century of history and kind of walk step by step to our present, where we have a lot of communities that are really suffering from food insecurities, among many other issues. So yeah, so a lot of this is going to be, like I said, this one particularly is going to be kind of a crash course. I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different topics, but definitely, yeah. I mean, don't feel like you feel overwhelmed or stuff. I actually teach a lot of. I used to be a history teacher, and I do a lot of like social justice history classes and stuff. I'll give you some links towards the end. So if you want to dive deeper into some of these things, I have a lot of other classes and things like that to check out. So yeah, don't feel overwhelmed. A lot of this, can be, it's a lot to it, but it's more about just kind of just the goal today is just kind of learn a little bit about a lot of things today. But anyway, okay, we'll get started. Um, cool. All right. So this is our table of contents. We're going to talk about what is food justice. We're going to talk a little bit about history of our industrial food system. Talk about the farm and food worker rights, different campaigns. We talk about food worker rights, a lot like restaurants and food processing plants and things like that. Environmental justice, animal welfare, and responsible consumerism. So we may not get to all of it, which is fine. I'll have this class recorded, and you'll have the PowerPoint and things like that. So but I want to start out just with the idea of what is food justice. And this is an organization from New York called Just Food. That's a really great definition. I'll read it. The food justice is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. Healthy food is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with care for the well-being of the land, workers, and animals. People practicing food justice leads to a strong local food system, self-reliant communities, and healthy environment. I really like this definition because it is really talking about how like what we're doing is we're creating like a local food economy where we're talking about all the aspects of food, from workers' rights to animals to land to the people that serve your food to culturally appropriate food. It's not just about getting any kind of food. It's about actually having dignity with food and actually having choice in food and communities actually being able to build their own local food systems. So I think this is a great place to just start with this idea of food justice. So with that, I'm going to lead into this really great TED Talk. LaDonna Redman, she's a Chicago food justice advocate. She did this back in 2013. Some of it's a little outdated, like she talks a little bit about initiatives that Obama could do and things. But it's a really great presentation that kind of really encompasses. It takes that first definition and kind of expands it a little bit bigger to include a lot of historical things. So I'd love for if people if you learn anything from this video, try to remember at least one thing that was new to you about food justice, and maybe we can have a discussion after this video. Cool.
Well, I stand strong on those that come before me. I have to call on my ancestors and let them know that I have not forgotten them. I stand strong because I stand on the shoulders of your ancestors as well. I want them to know that I have not forgotten them. I am an activist. I've always been an activist. I always will be an activist. And I became a food activist because my son, Wade, developed food allergies at a very early age. He's allergic to all dairy products, shellfish, eggs, and peanuts. And I wanted to get the healthiest food that I could for him. I wanted food that was free from genetically modified organisms. I wanted food that was free from pesticides. I wanted food basically that was grown healthy, organically. I really wasn't any different than any other mother in my community. I wanted the best for my son. I want the best for both of my children. But that food, the best food, was not available in my neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. So to change that situation, I got involved with what I really didn't know at the time was food justice. We started converting vacant lots to urban farm sites, lots that had not been used in decades. To grow food on them, we started to hire people from the community. And we started to build what we thought would be a local food system that responded to urban concerns. And so for me, the food system looked something like this. It was very simple, not too complicated, but that was what I understood the food system to be. And then I was introduced to this larger food movement, the one that says, you have to eat well, don't eat too much, eat mostly plants. I'm like, yes, I got that. I'm with that 100%. But where's my food? And I live in a community where I can get a semi-automatic weapon quicker than I can get a tomato. Now, a lot of people have tried to make this statement cute. They said that you can get ketchup quicker than you can get a tomato. I want us to really appreciate the public health message that I'm trying to get across here. And it's that the public health issue of violence is connected to the public health issue of chronic diet-related diseases. It's not about cute phrases or cute terms. It is about life and death. In my community, it is about living or dying. You can die by the gun or die from a lack of the proper food. But still, the food system has not changed. I've done all this work. We know all of these things, but the food system still, my idea of the food system still remained like that. And then I started to think, I really have to step this up a notch. What is Food Justice 2.0? Well, for me, Food Justice 2.0 is really about the narratives of people of color and beginning to understand that the story that we tell ourselves in the food movement is as important as the stories that we've left out. So for me, the food justice movement tells the story of colonialism and the impact of historical trauma on communities of color. Food justice talks about manifest destiny. It talks about settling the land in the West. The 19th century philosophy is like, we're going to go west. We're going to settle the land. But in food justice, we know that there were Native American people there. We know that they were pushed off of that land, and many of them killed so that others might be able to live. Now, we know that that's not the fault of the arriving European immigrants. But we must understand that the land that we stand on We stand on it because someone else's blood is also on it. We understand that food has been used as a weapon. Food used as a weapon during that period of time was used to push people off of land. We understand that the movement of people for the purposes of exploitation is a part of our food justice movement. We understand that the importation of African slaves into the United States, the enslavement of the Africans, provided the labor for what we now call our industrial food system. At the very beginning, folk were forced to work the land, and they had no choice in the conversation. They were not paid. At the core of what I believe to be the problems in our community, particularly when we start to talk about the accumulation of wealth or the lack of health, is really the conversation around slavery that has not been had in the United States. We have not reconciled the event of slavery or its impact. We have to understand that those Africans that were in the South after slavery were pretty much still enslaved after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. We also want to recognize in the food justice movement that the Homestead Act and the Emancipation Proclamation were signed at the same time, but the Africans could not take advantage of the Homestead Act. So they were forced to stay in the South and stay in a version of slavery, sharecropping, through the Black Codes, and then be forced out of the South through the Jim Crow laws and up into the North to a different version of racism and slavery. The food justice movement understands that in the 1960s, there are lots of things going on. But in the 1960s, for us, that's where civil rights meets food justice, right at the Woolworth lunch counter in 1963, where those students sat down and demanded the right to be treated as a human being. So for us, food justice is not just about the nutrition. That's important. It's not just about growing the food, but it's about dignity. It's about being visible. The 1960s also represent a time where the Black Panther Party started the free breakfast program in Oakland. We call these things into being because sometimes in the narrative of the larger food movement, it gets lost. In the 1960s, we talk about the hippie generation and the back to the land movement and the beginnings of organic food. And all of that is true and wonderful. And we like those stories too. Both and have to exist. And so we have to begin to tell a narrative or tell a story and develop a narrative that's much more robust than the narrative we tell ourselves today. We must also include in this narrative modern day slavery. We cannot forget that our food system today is still based on the exploitation of the labor of immigrants in this country. While we are talking about access to free-range chickens and grass-fed beef, we need to also be talking about immigration reform, fair wages for those farm workers, and the entire food chain workers also, the people who serve us, the people who fix our food, also should be paid fairly. We have to say no to food deserts. I don't live in a food desert. I never have. Food desert, the phrase, is another one of those cute terms, masking the harm of the food system in my community. It really is the Trojan horse of increased corporate control of the food system. I was not digging in the dirt on the west side of Chicago, thinking that I sure will be glad when that Walmart comes and builds that store there. That was not my thought. And yet there's still people who are hungry. And many of us would say, let's build a 501c3. Let's get one of those 501c3s. Let's get some more grants. Let's get the foundations in here. Let's fix the problem. That's fine. But the food justice movement is calling for jobs, economic justice. Let's pay people Not just raise the minimum wage, let's pay people a living wage so that they are not hungry. Let's address really the core issue of hunger, poverty. And so, as we try to say, well, maybe there's some period of time where we could go back and we could find the fair, just, and healthy food system that we're looking for. If we could just go back to the time where the food system is lit by the sun and driven by the energy of the sun, we will just be great. If we could just go back, we could turn back time. And the food justice movement would tell you that that time does not exist. There has never been a fair, just, or healthy food system in the United States of America. And so what we have is a global food industrial complex. This is what we have to dismantle. This is what we have to address. And there's a way to address it. We can be successful if we're able to really recognize that we have never, ever had a food system, and we must join together, create a narrative where all of us can sit around the table and create the food system that we need. We have to return to the kitchens of our ancestors, the tables of our ancestors. Reclaim your kitchens, reclaim your stove, your table, your grill, reclaim it, cook your food, make your food, know where your food comes from. But we must organize. We have to come together across this country and turn our nonprofit will into political will to change the food system. Because we absolutely have to go beyond the Farm Bill. We can't keep talking about the Farm Bill and thinking that the Farm Bill is the vehicle to change our food system. Clearly, it is not. So what's the vision? My vision is that we have President Obama sign an executive order mandating food justice for the United States of America, much like the environmental justice executive order. It's my hope and my dream that you will join me in the journey to change our food system.
All right. Really love LaDonna. Yeah, we'll just take a second and see if anyone kind of was there anything that anyone it kind of opened up their eyes on what a new aspect or a new perspective on food justice from that video, or did anyone learn anything from that video as well?
Yeah, Josh. There's a great video. I really enjoyed it, and for someone like me, like I mean, I've heard of food deserts, and I know of like some of these issues, but really, it opened my eyes to how broad and how intersectional the work of food justice is. Like talking about the history of colonialism and slavery and how that's related to our modern day food system is not something I think about every day. And thinking about the 60s and what she was saying about the back to the land movement and the organic movement, I'm aware of all that, but then also thinking how the civil rights movement is just as relevant and just as important to shaping our modern day food systems is very eye-opening, and I'm glad I learned that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was the first time that was how I felt the first time I saw that video. Allison writes, very powerful about deep connections and the need for a very deep and broad systemic reform, racial justice work, immigration reform. Thank you for focusing on this. Cool. Yeah, Alana, she's got other speeches. She's fantastic. I definitely would check her out, spend a YouTube rabbit hole night, checking her out. But cool. Any last thoughts on that video before we move on? All right. So our next section, we're going to kind of dive into a lot of the things she was talking about and kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive on how these things, intersected with food justice. So I really like these two quotes. They really kind of capture this idea that a lot of times we talk about like the food insecurities and food deserts and things like they're a glitch in the system. When we really take a deep dive into our history, it really it seems more like this is the system. This is the intentions. I really like this quote. Do I believe everything happens for a reason? Yes, and the reason is colonialism. And I think about so I actually teach a lot of classes on colonialism, and it's a really powerful piece of history that we don't really focus on in our normal history class. And just for example, if you look at these countries down here, colonialism, European colonialism reached every country in the world but like four. So like, and even those were somewhat colonized. So Europe, colonized and brought with them all these systems, whether it's slavery, like patriarchy existed before colonialism, but they institutionalized it, and brought it, to the point where you can go to any capitalist country and women are making less for the same job than men. It's part of what a rise of capitalism, colonialism. I think of about like during the George Floyd protests. I remember reading about how Australia was there was this huge Black Lives Matter movement, marching in the streets in Australia, and I'm sure like they cared about George Floyd, but they weren't in the streets for George Floyd. They're in the streets because they were essentially fighting the same systemic oppression, the same systems, the same white supremacy that all of these countries that were colonized were. And you look directly at the rates of poverty and the exact same, like the ones that were completely colonized as settler colonies, like America or US and Canada and Australia, they're doing great, but all the deep poverty is a direct reflection of the colonization. I remember I used to, think that there was just like, poor countries just like messed up or just like weren't, there's some, that's how things settled. But in reality, when you look at colonialism, I mean, it really, I mean, there's a direct connection between, how the world looks and how it was colonized. And that really shows with our food system. So if we really want to understand the beginnings of our food system, we need to understand the beginning of colonization, particularly the beginning of capitalism as well. So capitalism, just get a real short history, but capitalism really arose in Europe and like particularly between the 14 and 1600s. There's a lot of different perspectives. Adam Smith talked about how capitalism rose market efficiencies and things like that, and production of labor and all this divisions of labor and things like that. Karl Marx saw it as like class, conflict and class divides and things like that. But lately, in like I really enjoyed like last like 10 to 20 years, there's been the really push of post-colonial, particularly feminist perspectives on the history of capitalism. This one really, I think, if you really want to understand like a really great perspective on it, Sylvia Federici, writes this feminist perspective on capitalism during this period, and she talks about how we talk about how we teach that capitalism was this natural transition from feudalism, but what she talks about how is like during the 14th and 1600s there was like thousands of peasant revolts, all over Europe, and people were fighting for this more egalitarian society, particularly after the Black Plague hit, because before then there were so many peasants that they didn't have much power, if they didn't like the situation, they just got booted. But after the Black Plague hit and it wiped out majority of the workers, all of a sudden the workers that were left had a lot of power, and they started striking, they started revolting, they started winning all these gangs, all these benefits. And then what capitalism was this counter revolution to them, of trying to maintain control over the peasants, through a lot of different things, from destroying the commons, creating mass poverty, and basically creating, forcing peasants to live in poverty where they had no choice but to work in these horrific situations and to go to these, factories that were being built in industrial revolution. But it was basically this new system that created a lot of wealth wealth through exploiting land and labor, and that idea of like exploiting land and labor for wealth, that was like at the heart of this capitalist system that was imported to almost every country in the world, and that's really what founded what was the roots of our system, where we had if you look at the beginning of colonialism in the Americas, South America was Spanish colonialism. They used this system, Encomienda. I always mess up that pronunciation, but it was like basically expansion of feudalism and slavery. But then North America, there was some Spanish, but then most of it was, and some French, but most of it was British colonialism. And what they, the first colonies in America or in North America were corporations, were corporate ventures, were basically these corporations, were looking to make a lot of money. And so they would get approval from the king, and the monarchy, and then they would set up our first, they would set up our first, settlements were basically like tobacco plantations, and their main goal was to make as much money from exploiting wealth and exploiting land and labor, so they created this plantation system, where they, at first, they got the free land from basically killing and stealing the land from indigenous populations, and then they used a variety of cheap labor or exploited labor. First they enslaved indigenous people, then they brought in indentured servants, sorry, who were basically poor Europeans. A lot of them were arrested for being poor and not having a job. Like the first vagrancy laws came from this time period, and they're arrested, and part of their punishment is that they were sent over here to work. But then eventually they replaced them with African, enslaved Africans, and that became the backbone of our not only the foundation of this country, but also the foundation of our industrial food system was, using, stolen land, and then using as exploited labor, particularly around enslaved labor. So I really like this quote by Blaine Snipstall. He has a lot of great organizations. He works with Earthbound Building. They're a worker co-op that actually build a lot of local farm, if you need like, pavilions and hoop houses and greenhouses and stuff. It's a really amazing organization. But he writes, the industrial food system as we know it today is the child of a plantation system and agriculture. They are both built upon exploited labor, disposition, exploitation of land from indigenous peoples, the destruction of rural culture and land, consolidation of power and land in the ruling class, and the forced migration of peoples. The plantation system was the first major system used by the colonial forces in their violent transformation of the earth into land, people into property, and nature into commodity, all to be sold on the fair market. And if we take that concept, the exploitation of land and labor, well, as I said, the land came from, indigenous land. Since the beginning of this country to the present, we have stolen over 1.5 billion acres of native land through a variety of pretty horrific, means. But that was actually a huge reason why we sell the idea of Revolutionary War. We fought, for taxation without representation, but we actually, in the last couple of decades, we learned that there was a lot of other reasons too. One of them being the British were keeping the colonialists from actually expanding westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains through different proclamations, and a lot of our founding fathers were land speculators. With huge investments, so they wanted to expand west. Our first thing, our first piece of legislation that we passed as a country was the Northwest Ordinance, which was just basically mapping out the ethnic cleansing of Native and indigenous populations out west. So that was, that was where the exploited land came from. But then when we look at labor, so another reason we went to, we fought a Revolutionary War was. Britain was actually in the process through a series of different cases and declarations, was in the process of actually outlawing slavery. First, they actually did outlaw slavery in England, but they were working on outlawing slavery across all their colonies, and that's really what the South was not on board with a Revolutionary War until they found that out, and that was they were able to come on board. basically from that, because that was a huge part of our food systems, our economies, was exploited labor, was slavery. Like I said, we started out with enslaved indigenous people and indentured servants, but eventually, beginning with 1619, we turned towards enslaved labor from Africa, and that we really downplay how much that has really built not only this country, but also modern Europe and also Industrial Revolution. And there's a really great book called "The Half Has Never Been Told" that really captures just like slavery built this country. Majority of cotton that was the Industrial Revolution. The main product was textiles from cotton, and the majority of the cotton was picked from enslaved hands in the U.S. We're talking trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth that created this country. But even then, eventually, 1865, the Civil War happens, and we outlaw slavery. But then we turn to what was called slavery by another name, where all these new systems, propped up that were basically very similar to slavery, oftentimes even worse in certain circumstances, that continued our industrial agricultural system, from sharecropping, where the owner of the land, oftentimes former enslavers would give a little piece of land to some sharecroppers. They would rent it out, they rent their tools, and then they have to sell it, wherever they grew, they had to get a percentage to the owner, and ultimately they would become in debt, and it was called debt peonage. It was basically a way where you never escaped debt, and you became enslaved through debt. And then on top of that, they created a whole convict leasing system where they had vagrancy laws and black codes and things, all these things that basically criminalized black life. And then when black people were arrested, they were leased out to these same farms to work and in the same plantations that were used to be operated by slaves or enslaved people. And that we still have many forms of that. We still use prison labor, for a lot of agricultural systems today. So that is still going on, even though it technically ended in 1927. It's still in many ways continuing to this day. But then eventually, around the 1800s, there was a push to push a lot of black farmers out of their land. We'll talk about that in a second. And it was replaced by even more cheaper, more exploited labor, and that came with immigrants of color. So a lot of migrant workers, undocumented workers, a lot from Asia, but then a lot from South America, and that's essentially who is picking our food today, who is the exploited labor today. So it's really important to understand that this system didn't go away. I mean, we didn't, transcend the system. We continued keeping, our industrial agriculture system continues to rely on exploited labor. We just, changed who we're exploiting. Even though it's always, someone, it's always someone, an immigrant of color or an enslaved African. It's always, indigenous person. But even to this day, I mean, this is a picture of, in 2020 when they had this crazy fires. And they're telling everyone to go, don't leave your house. The air is so bad. At that moment, there was, migrant workers, many of them undocumented workers that were still picking our food in these horrific conditions. And that's important to understand, is like, we never really escaped this. This is still the same system that was started in 1600s, is still the same one that's operating in industrial agriculture. I will read this, another Blaine Snipsall quote. He writes, the two critical pieces with the development of industrial food system has been and will continue to be land and labor. And within that context of land and labor, within US agrarian history, we can say that the particular disposition and colonization of indigenous people's lands, and then the subsequent disposition of Black owned land in the 20th century, consistent discrimination and violence towards people of color and migrants in the food system, the dwindling population of small to medium scale farms, and historically persistent exploitative use of people of color as farm workers is important to name. So on top of that, we'll go back to land. Land is a big part of this, because at the same time, we're moving westward, manifest destiny. Where we talk about all these like big land giveaways, the Homestead Act and all this stuff, how we gave, millions of free, acres of land to white settlers, but we kind of skipped the fact that this was all indigenous land that people were either ethnically cleansed or murdered or tricked off of their land, and then we gave it away in huge amounts. So, the Indian Removal Act, gave away 25 million acres, Homestead Act, 270 acres, Dawes Act, 90 acres. These are all huge land giveaways that was only for white settlers, who, primarily, a huge part of this created the early white, the farmers, our industrial agricultural system. A lot of this land that was given away was eventually turned into agriculture. And I want to play this. This is a short clip by Martin Luther King. This is a couple weeks before he was killed. He was preparing for the Poorest People campaign, where they're trying to, they're basically, he was expanding, trying to create economic justice. We teach a whitewashed version of Martin Luther King. Like he had a dream. He got some civil rights legislation. Everything was fixed. It was great. But ultimately, like he eventually said that his dream turned into a nightmare, and without economic justice and political justice and restructuring, that we would never, really, we would never, achieve justice in this country. And so I want to play this. This is a speech he gave right before the Poor People's Campaign.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with. And this is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
It disappeared. Wait a minute. It didn't disappear. You might forget Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. The Poor People's Campaign was supposed to go to Washington in April. Mm-hmm. So the organization that mobilized it was essentially decapitated and thrown into chaos about 3 weeks before it was supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. Those organizations were being, as I said, once the Civil Rights Acts were completed, that was it. Government was through with us. They're not interested in restructure. There has never been any interest in restructuring the economy for the benefit of the poor. I don't know whether you're going to talk about the bonus army, go back to Shays' Rebellion. I mean, this is like the no-no. This is a capitalist society. It's built on inequality and avarice in many ways.
So that woman was Kathleen Carver. She was a Black Panther leader for a while, and also later became a law professor. So now I'm going to talk about Black farmland, because this is a big part of our food, our food systems. Because so we'll start out like so we go back to the Civil War. General Sherman is doing I forget what it's called, like the Rush to the Sea or something, where he's basically leading his army behind enemy lines and just pillaging and burning the South's ability even to continue the Civil War, and many people credit this to the South giving up or whatever, surrendering. and so Sherman, like at the same time, he's like burning down these plantations and he's freeing all these, enslaved people, and they're all going with him. They're kind of a lot of them go with the army, and so he eventually, he sits down with a lot of black leaders at the time and asks, like, what is it that you all are going to need, after the Civil War to survive, or what is the, and all of them were like, we need land. That's the number one thing. Like we need land more than anything else. So from there, he created what was called the Sherman's, the Special Field Orders number 15, which is basically later called 40 Acres and a Mule. What the idea is, he worked with the Freeman Bureau, with his temporary, agency that was set up to kind of help free the black people from the South, with, and, hospitals and education and all this stuff. But they tried, the biggest thing they tried to do was bring, give land, do the land distribution, from, because they captured a lot of land from Confederates, and especially around the southern coastline and like South Carolina and stuff. They end up actually gave away a lot of land. Some like 38,000 or like 40,000 free people got their 40 acres. But then eventually, if you learn, we do a terrible job teaching about Reconstruction, which is like this period, a decade after Civil War, where we actually try to create an egalitarian society in the South. The radical Republicans, which are opposite of Republicans today, but eventually, Andrew Johnson, became president. He pardoned a lot of Confederates, and he took back most of that land. Some were able to keep it. Some were able to like produce actual legal deeds, but like 30, most of the people, you had to give back their land. And that land today is like worth trillions. And we're talking like $6.4 trillion that was lost during that time. But at the same time, against crazy odds, against like Jim Crow, against all horrific South, because the South was horrific after the Civil War and for a really long time. But still, black people were able to manage to accumulate 15 million acres. They were a huge percentage of farmers in the early 1900s. They were 14% of all farms were black owned. And then, starting around like the early 1900s to the 20th century, like 90% of that farmland what was lost. I'm sure some of it was sold away or whatever, but most of it was lost through some pretty bad means. We'll talk about that in a second. But and a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's just the trend, or that was like when things mechanized, a lot of people lost land. But if you look at this is a graph, and the red one is white farmers, the green ones black farmers. The black farmers were the people that lost the most farmland over the last century. So Bell Hooks says, we have forgotten the black farmer, both the farmer of the past and those remaining invisible farmers who still work the land. Has been an interest of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy to hide and erase their story, for they are the ancestors who gave black folk from slavery on and into Reconstruction the oppositional consciousness. So even today, there's about 2 million acres left of that was owned by black people. About 2% of all farms are black at this point. So we saw a huge amount that was taken over the last century. And these are kind of like the biggest ways that people took them. A lot of it was deceit. Ta-Nehisi Coates, writes a lot about this in this article, The Case for Reparations, where he talks about how a lot of it was like, during slavery times, and especially Jim Crow, many ways it was illegal, or at least it was prevented for black people to read. So a lot of black people in the South, were illiterate after the Civil War, and a lot of white people took advantage of that. Taking them to court, a lot of shady stuff, claiming they had back taxes, and they were able to confiscate, tons of acreage from that. A lot of it was like lynching and terrorism. We get this idea that lynching was just about protecting white women or whatever. That was complete BS. Lynching was many reasons why white people lynched, but a lot of it was to steal land. So there's this quote by Ray Winbush. He writes, this idea that most blacks were lynched because they did something untoward to a young woman. That's not true. Most black men were lynched between 1890 and 1920 because whites wanted their land. A lot of it was just pure racial discrimination. I mean, they were working in Jim Crow South, so it wasn't a whole lot of places that black farmers could sell their food in their market. So they lost a lot from that. USDA, discrimination. USDA has a long history of racial discrimination. Where USDA provides a lot of benefits, like giving loans, farm loans, disaster relief if you're flooding, insurance, subsidies, credit, all the different kinds of stuff. And they mainly, over the last century, has only given it to white people, which has caused a huge amount of black loss of black farmland. And there was two cases, the Pickford cases in 1999 and then '08, that actually, they were able to get billions of dollars of settlements to black farmers. But if you look at like the average settlement, I think was like 40,000 or 50,000. And if you lost a farm, like 100-acre farm, I mean, that's, it's nowhere close to what they needed. Some of it is property tax. This was a common thing, is that they would, if white people wanted a black farm, they would they would overvalue it and then overtax it to the point that black people couldn't pay the taxes, and then they would take that land. So that was like Thurgood Marshall wrote a lot about this. He fought this a lot. He said this was one of the huge ways that white people were able to steal black farmland. But the biggest one, and the one that we probably don't talk a whole lot about, I think there's been some good stuff written about it lately. Like ProPublica has done this really great article. This is called the heirs property and partition sales. So heirs property is basically like anytime you don't have a will and you die, your land is basically or your all the things you own is basically just evenly distributed to your heirs, to your next of kin, and so that's pretty normal process. But unfortunately in the South, especially during Jim Crow period, because most black people couldn't read because of slavery and because of Jim Crow, most black people didn't have wills, because they couldn't, all the lawyers were white, most of them didn't work with black people, so it was very few options to get a will. So when most black people died over the last century, and particularly in the South, they didn't have a will, so that their property was just distributed among their surviving heirs. Which can be really difficult because you don't actually get a deed to that stuff. So you can't get loans from banks. You can't qualify for disaster relief. Like when Hurricane Katrina hit, New Orleans, a lot of black people couldn't get relief because they had heirs property. They didn't have actual deeds. It's pretty difficult to do stuff. So they created this process called partition sales, where basically if one person wanted to manage the land and he wanted to get an actual deed, so he can get loans and things, he could force the court to do what's called a partition sale, where basically the court puts the whole property up for sale, and then hopefully that one person that wants it, will bid it for it and get it, and then have an actual deed to it. The problem is a lot of times in the South, a lot of the black land was it was basically land that didn't have much value in the early 1900s. Like a lot of it was like coastal land. And that, for farm aspects wasn't very valuable, but all of a sudden in the 50s and 60s, there was a huge tourist boom in the South. And all of a sudden that land was super valuable. Places like Hilton Head and along the South Carolina coast and places like that, were like ground zero, where it used to be all black owned. And now it's like almost completely white owned. Because what they would do is, these developers would find some heir to that property that they wanted. Sometimes it'd be someone living in another state that didn't even realize he had an heir's right to that property, but they would find them. They would give them, a small fee to get them to do a partition sale, and then or they would sell their little piece of their heirs property rights to that developer, and then the developer would go to the court, get a partition sale. He would outbid everyone that was actually living on that property, and then the developer would get that and kick everybody out. And that process, something like half of all black land loss in the South, worth billions, was stolen through these partition sales. Liz, Presser writes, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has recognized it as a leading cause of black involuntary land loss. Heirs property is estimated to make up more than a third of Southern black-owned land, 3.5 million acres worth more than 28 billion. These landowners were vulnerable to laws and loopholes that allow spectators and developers to acquire their property. Black farmers watch as their land is auctioned on courthouse steps or forced into sale against their will. And definitely read, if you want to learn more about it, read this ProPublica article. It's a pretty long article, but it's a pretty, it did a really great job describing this process. So these are like kind of a lot of things. I'm sure there's other things as well, but these are some of the main reasons why, you know, in the early 1910s, Black people lost so much land by 1997, some like 90% of their farmland. So that's why we don't see a whole lot of Black farmers because of all this stuff anymore. And then on top of all this, there's been a push to get, bring back, Black people to farming. And there is, we see this a lot. Like I work in a lot of communities where we try to build new urban ags, farms and things like that. And we do see this, that there is this association to farming, from Black people and Black communities about this, the association, of slavery, of sharecropping, of convict leasing, of just, historical trauma around farming. And a lot of this, there's been a lot of new research to coming on that actually how trauma is actually, captured into our genes, and they're called epigenetics, and can actually pass down that. It's not like the memory of trauma, but it's the negative health consequences of the trauma, everything from, like the stress consequences to the wear and tear of your body to different, health risks and stuff that can actually be passed down. And so there's just been this huge movement now to try to separate that trauma from the land. Leah Penniman, she runs a Soul Fire Farm. She wrote the book Farming While Black. She writes, there is a danger and confusion and oppression that our people experience on land with the spirit of the land itself. And there's actually a coworker of mine, Xavier Brown. He started this organization called Soilful City, where they actually, one of the biggest things he does is he actually trying to turn that around and actually shows how you can actually heal from a lot of historical trauma around, by going back to the land and trying to separate that trauma from that land. And then on top of all this, in the mid 1900s, we have the rise of our industrial agricultural system. So this happens right after World War II. So we start, it's this whole idea of like, technology, innovation is going to save the world. Chemicals are great. All this stuff is great. And basically, we just create this like this farm system on steroids, where we just start growing so much food. Particularly after the Green Revolution, which we'll talk about in a second. But we just start with this idea that the population of the world is expanding, so we need to feed that population, so we need to grow, exponentially amount of food. So we just start these huge agricultural systems that just, based on a lot of, technology and stuff that was created in the Green Revolution around producing, enormous amount of, industrial agricultural, using tons of chemicals and pesticides and water heavy, pollution, and we just create these monocultural farm systems that just start producing an enormous amount of food, but at the same time, a huge consequence to like workers' rights, to animal welfare, environment, to community health, and all different kinds of things. Like industrial agriculture, to the point where industrial agriculture system is one of the leading causes of our pollution in this country, in the world right now, is coming from our agricultural system. So that's how severe this we went. And then at the same time, we consolidated. We ran out a lot of small scale farmers out during these systems, because a lot of these new technologies, of like having chemicals and pesticides and all this stuff, the small scale farmer couldn't afford or compete at. So we see just this monopoly occurring, over the last like half century since the rise of our industrial agricultural system. Where we see a handful of companies control the the entire majority of the pork market, the beef market, the chicken market, and they're able to dictate horrific terms on their farms and on their farm workers. There's a really it's well done documentary called Under Contract, where a majority of our chicken farmers are contracted. 97% they have these contracts under these three companies, Tyson and Purdue. And it's just like it's like sharecropping, under these they never get out of debt. They have to like pay all this money, to retrofit things, and then they have to borrow, and they just it's become this debt peonage all over again. And same, we're seeing the monopoly of seed production. We see, 5 companies control majority of seeds now, and they all have patents, which is kind of scary because that's how our world feeds itself. And at the same time, on the other end, we see this consolidation of supermarkets, and we'll talk more about this in the next class. But how early 1900s, there was lots of local community-owned grocery stores and markets and things like that, and most of that got pushed out through what we call supermarkets, which really came with 1930s, but really blew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s to the point where majority of our food is now supermarkets, and once they run out all the small scale, community co-ops and markets, then they can they have a lot of control on who gets healthy food and who doesn't, where they build shops and where they move grocery stores and stuff. So it's communities lost a lot of self-reliance, and we lost a lot of power, and as our food systems are basically consolidated in these monopolies. And then I did this slide. Sorry, it's a lot of words, but I was watching this PBS documentary about Norman Borlaug, this guy up here. So he's basically known as the father of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was basically in the 50s and 60s. A bunch of big foundations like Rockefeller and stuff. They were really worried about our population getting too big and not being able to feed everyone. So they invested a lot of money and research into trying to figure out how to create new strands of food and how to grow more food to meet this growing population. So they sent they started a research facility in Mexico and eventually sent Norman Borlaug to go down there to try to breed different strands of wheat and try to create more stronger, more productive wheat. And he eventually did. He created some really powerful and productive strands of wheat. Unfortunately, the wheat that he created, eventually, there was corn and all that stuff that created as well, it needed tons of inputs. It needed tons of fertilizers and pesticides and water, which is the whole point of this was to create strands for poor farmers. And actually Norman Borlaug's boss tried to shut the whole thing down because he was so worried, because he's like, no one can afford this but huge industries, so he was really worried, and rightly so, about what was going to happen to the poor farmers who couldn't afford all these, and they wouldn't be able to compete. But it didn't really bother everyone else, so they created these crops and kind of went around the world selling these crops to people. And there's a scene where he goes to India, and he just gets all mad because the prime ministers at first at India, they're like, no, we don't want this, because he's basically like, buy this, food, but it comes with patents and all this control, and basically Western corporations are going to have a whole lot of control over your food systems, and you're going to need to buy chemicals and fertilizers and patent, seeds and stuff. And India was like, no, we don't want this at all. And there's like a scene where he gets all mad and he's like yelling at him. He's like, you're just going to let your people starve. And eventually they forced him, the US, decided to we threatened to deny them this aid, unless they started opening up their food systems to this stuff. But it's just like, it was crazy because during this documentary, they never once mentioned colonialism, which is crazy to me, because I looked up. So colonial is Britain colonized, India, in like the mid 1700s. And it wasn't until 1948 did they give them independence, but they gave them, a horrific situation that caused, when they gave them independence, they set them up for this horrible war and all this stuff. So it really was, it was like a decade later, after all this stuff, Norman Borlaug walks in and is like, hey, let Western European country corporations take over your food systems again. But it's important to understand, because colonialism, what colonialism did to India, because we were like, oh, well, they just have too many people. That's bullshit. That's like the overpopulation argument is actually like a white supremacist argument. Like, there's not, there wasn't too many people. They were dealing with colonial structures. For example, I was reading this really great article. It's called "Putting Wheat in Its Place." It was about, in the early 1800s or mid 1800s, India was like one of the best textiles and best clothes, and the cotton products came from India. And Britain wanted to be that, people, that best, seller of textiles. So they colonized, through military force, they colonized India. And then yeah, India, the farmers, the cotton farmers, they had, the commons, they had common land that anyone could grow cotton. So they grow their own food on their farms and then grow cotton on common lands. And and then they would process the stuff in home, and then sell it to the markets. And then they had, they were doing really well in the system. But Britain came in, they outlawed the commons, passed all these laws. They forced, the cotton farmers couldn't, produce, they can only grow, they removed all the food. They weren't allowed to grow their own food. They forced their farms to only grow cotton. And then they took that cotton and brought it back to Britain to process it, using the same techniques that Indians used, and to create clothes, and then brought back and sold it back to the Indian farmers that used to make their own clothes. And basically it created this horrific situation of poverty. Like, it just impoverished this country, created all kinds of famines, all kinds of horrific situations for centuries. And then, then they finally give them independence, but in such a shitty way that, it causes this horrific war. And then, a couple years later, Norman Borlaug comes in and it's like, hey, will you let us take over your food systems? And he gets all angry, like the white guy yelling at, and then like, oh, you guys just don't care about your people. It's just crazy. But that's what we need to understand about the Green Revolution. It was based on these ideas that we had too many people in this world, and we just had to grow enough food to feed everyone. But the problem is even Norman Borlaug admitted, later on in his life that, after everyone adopted this stuff, these products, as right now we grow enough food. There's 7.5 billion people in this world, and we grow enough food for 10 billion people, yet 25,000 people every day starve to death. And that's not because we're not growing enough food. That's because we still live in these colonial structures of inequality where people can't get access to food, and we have plenty of food. It was never a problem that there wasn't enough food being grown. The problem was it was structures of inequality, that where people couldn't get access to food. Even in this country, we grow enough food in the U.S., to feed everyone, but there's still millions of people that don't get enough food every day. And that's not about access. It's about, these colonial structures. But the problem was because they sold this idea that if we just, it's a supply issue, if we just grow more food, we sold this Green Revolution, which basically, it had horrific consequences. It essentially, it wiped out small scale. Norman Borlaug's boss was right. It wiped out small scale farmers across the country. They couldn't afford to buy all these inputs, and they couldn't compete with these industrial agriculture people that were, or if they could, a lot, like in India, a lot of farmers, there's still a lot of small scale farmers, but most of them are in horrific debt, because they have to go in debt to pay for all these, the pesticides and herbicides and seeds and all this stuff. And at the same time, all this stuff is like killing them. It's killing our soils, it's killing our communities. Like India's just had a horrific public health crisis of like cancers and things like that, directly linked to the Green Revolution. So that's where we get to the point where we need to understand that our food systems are more, we need to decolonize our food systems, not and so sorry, that was a long story, so that's the Green Revolution. It's important to understand how we got here, and the Green Revolution was a very important part of kind of continuing these colonial systems. And when we talk about decolonization, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one slide because we're already taking up a lot of time, but I just want to explain this word really quickly, decolonization, and then I'll let you guys kind of, spend your time learning more about it. But decolonization is really understanding that all the systems that have been set up through colonialism, set up all over the world, and just understanding how we dismantle these systems or replace them with better systems, and that can range from just history. Like we teach, I used to be a high school history teacher, and I can tell you hands down, we teach a very white, Eurocentric fake whitewashed history, and it's not doing us very good right now. So we need to understand our real history. We need to, good and bad. We need to, look at dismantling systems, from white supremacy to, neoliberal capitalism to, classism to all these different things, patriarchy. And we also need to work like economic justice, like reparations and things like that, supporting determination, realizing, understanding the impacts internally, like what we absorbed through colonialism, and also understanding, going back to like very, indigenous cultures as well, indigenous practices, like all the fires that were blowing up in California in these last couple of years. Indigenous people in California used to control fires, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and their practices were outlawed, and that's what's led to this horrific fire situation. And there are even people are trying to go back to these indigenous practices. So really, that's where we talk about decolonization. It's just kind of dismantling everything that came with colonialism. But yeah, like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time. I want to get back to food justice. I just want to explain that term real quick. All right. So next part we're going to talk about is the actual workers. So the first section, we're not going to dive too much more into history. It was a few history lessons, but I wanted to kind of get to the present and talk about who's actually not only picking our food, but also serving our food as well and processing our food. So it's important to understand that we have all these federal labor laws that protect us, that give us the right to unions, that give us, overtime pay, minimum wages, worker comp, all that stuff. But in order to pass that, they passed that stuff. FDR passed that during the New Deal. But during this time period after the Civil War, the South, there's a brief period of Reconstruction where we tried to create some equality, but that was overturned by white supremacy, and then the South basically was controlled by basically ex-Confederates for and Dixiecrats and all these people for the next century. So anything any piece of legislation that needed support from the South had to find ways to exclude Black people particularly, but people of color, BIPOC as well. So in order to pass this stuff, they had to negotiate ways to exclude labor laws from mainly Black people. And then two industries that Black people were working with were domestic housework and farmers, and those two industries were excluded from all of these labor protections. So even to this day, there are some farmers on big farms that are included on some of this, but even to this day, farmers are excluded from labor protections. And then when we think about the people, like I said, after Black farmers started to be pushed out from farmland, we turned to immigrants of color to do most of our farming, and you see this pattern. First mid 1800s and early 1900s, it was a lot of Asian farm workers, Chinese, Japanese, a lot of people from Philippines, and so we needed these people to run these farms. So we opened up all this immigration, brought a lot of people, recruited a lot of people. They not only just farm work, they helped a lot with building the railroads and all this stuff. But at the same time, a lot of people use them as politically, use them as a scapegoat. Created an enormous amount of racism, around there, caricatures, stereotypes, blamed them for any kind of economic, downturns, and then eventually, created horrible legislation to really oppress them, from the Chinese Exclusion Act. To all different kinds of things. I definitely recommend. We do a terrible job teaching Chinese history, or Chinese American history. So PBS has this amazing documentary. I definitely recommend checking out. And so then in the early 1930s, a lot of particularly Filipino farmers started organizing. So that's where a lot of white farm owners turned to Mexican farm workers and started recruiting a lot more. And again, we needed them to, to do a lot of these farm work and stuff. So we had all these programs, brought them in, and then, then we blamed them for the Great Depression and the Mexican repatriation, expelled, deported, almost 2 million Mexican workers, some of them even U.S. citizens, and caused all kinds of racism and stuff against them. And then, come back, 1940s, all these people go to war, so we need more farm workers. So we have the Bracero program that recruits more farm workers. And then when people came back, Eisenhower, there was a lot of people were looking, there's some economic situations that Eisenhower blamed, a lot of a lot of politicians blamed on these Mexican farm workers. So then we had, I won't say the name because it's a slur, but Operation W, where we again mass deported pretty horrifically. A lot of people died during these deportations, like millions of almost 1 million Mexican workers again. So you see this pattern rising where we need, exploited labor. So we turn to these communities of color, immigrants of color. We exploit them. You pay them very little to work in these industries that we need to survive. I mean, we need these workers to actually literally pick our food. But then as soon as there's a economic downturn or some kind of situation, they become scapegoats, and there's just horrific immigration policies that follow. So you have to understand, like, what Trump was doing, how he scapegoated immigrants. This wasn't a new thing. This is like a pattern that's been happening for the last 200 years in this country. And that brings us to the 1970s, where mainly most of our farm workers are, it used to be majority Mexican, but I think it's like combination of Mexican and Central American. Majority are undocumented, are migrant workers, or they have these H-2 guest pass where they have like 0 rights and they're treated pretty horrifically. And that's what brings us today, where we look at, so we have about 2 to 3 million farm workers in the US. A little over half are undocumented. And then half of them are U.S. citizens, and then another or a quarter of them are U.S. citizens, and a quarter of them are through some guest worker program. Even though the guest worker program is like legal, it's a pretty horrific program where they can't leave. If they leave, they're considered undocumented at that point. So they send them to these farms, like Trump's like vineyards and stuff, all use these programs, and it just exploit. I mean, it's just terrible conditions. But you look at, I mean, like the stats on our farmers, the average income is like $15,000 a year. It's considered one of the 3 most dangerous occupations in the United States. It's more dangerous to be a farmer than it is to be a police officer. Like, it's literally like there's more, injuries and death in farm work. There's a rampant abuse, pesticide exposures, health concerns. The life expectancy of a migrant worker is literally 49 years, as opposed to 75 for our national average. Pretty horrific conditions for children and housing. Only 10% of farm workers have health insurance. But even then, there's barriers to healthcare. If you're undocumented, I mean, especially during Trump era, like, I mean, they were getting people at hospitals and schools and things that were previously kind of off limits. All kinds of racism, and living in this constant like trauma and fear of this constant being deported, especially with your kids, losing your kids and things like that. So it's a pretty rough situation for farm workers. And then on top of that, it's not just farm workers, it's also food processing workers. So food processing, our history of food processing, there was actually an NPR special today that talked a little bit about it, but it ended kind of a terrible job. But they, actually John Oliver does a great section on meat packing industry. Definitely recommend checking it out. It's like 15 minutes. And he did a really good job on that. But like the history of, meat processing, urban meat processing factories started coming up in the early 1900s. They were horrific places to work. That's where Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, about how horrible it was, and that actually caused a lot of national movement to have better safety standards. And actually, over the next 50 years, they actually meat packers actually became a good job. They actually got a lot of worker protections. They get well paid. They had a lot of safety measures. It was actually a reasonably good place to work up until about the 80s. '80s, where a lot of large companies worked with the Reagan administration to kind of dismantle all that, to break up unions, to decrease workers' rights, decrease benefits. At the same time, they started transferring who was working in a lot of these places, especially in the South. A lot of them were black workers, and during the '70s and '80s, there was a lot of worker forces that were trying to unionize. So to get away from that, a lot of places like BC Rogers are owned by Koch brothers, which not the same, Koch brothers that we think of with the anti-climate change folks, but it was a different company. But they instead of to get away from a lot of their black workers they were trying to unionize, they actually set up these hiring programs where they would actually send people down to Mexico and recruit them and bring them back and help them. Most of them were undocumented. They would help them find places, help to live, and then they would work them really hard with no benefits and very little pay. But eventually, even those places were starting to organize against this horrific situation. So even so I don't know if you remember in 2019, there was this horrific ICE raid on this Mississippi poultry factory where something like 680 undocumented workers, mostly women, mostly mothers, were arrested. And I'm sure many of them deported. That was actually one of these, that was BC Rogers. They had recruited, 20 years ago, they recruited these people to come over, create these communities, and they were exploiting them like crazy. But then they started organizing, especially particularly around harassment. There was a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of wage theft against these workers. So they actually won a civil rights case against these people the year before, and then the very next year, like less than a year, all of a sudden these people get targeted and deported. And no consequences to the owners of the factory. The people brought them in, just consequences to the workers. So again, this idea that we use these people to continue this model that that can only survive off exploited labor, and then when it's not economically beneficial or politically beneficial, we use them as scapegoats. And at the same time, we, there's a lot of attack on undocumented farmers, but I don't think people realize that we wouldn't have a food system without undocumented farmers. Not only that is, this is, obviously conservative political, push is a lot of Republicans use this as they scapegoat these people, saying that they take more than they give, which is just not true. Undocumented workers, give way more to this country than they take. They bring in tens of billions of dollars into our agricultural systems that would not be able to operate without them. They even voluntarily, millions of them voluntarily file, even though they're not citizens. They don't have to do this, but they voluntarily file a social security number and they pay social security, to programs that they're not even allowed. Like they'll never qualify for social security, but they pay into these programs to the tune of like tens of billions of dollars. They pay every year voluntarily on top of sales tax and property taxes and payroll taxes and all this other stuff. They bring in an enormous amount to our economy, and at the same time, our food system would not function without them. So it's just it's criminal that we scapegoat these people so much politically. And at the same time, there's always like this, oh, well, they cause these recessions and stuff, but there was, there's actually like, there was the urban fruit workers, Cesar Chavez's organization, actually, like when, during 2010, when the Republicans were saying, oh, they're stealing all of our jobs, they actually created this program where they would allow white people to come into these farms and they would give them jobs and stuff. And like, no one did it. Like 100 people showed up and it was just so horrific that none of them left. So it's not even it's horrific. And then this is this is so in 2018, but this is a really powerful article. This is again another like crazy fires happening in California. Everyone's evacuating but the farm workers, they're staying and picking our food so we can actually survive as a nation. But I won't read this article, but it's a really great article. It just talks about what it's like to live in this constant fear of being deported, especially when you have children. Sorry. So it's just it's a terrible way to treat people who basically keep our food system alive. All right, so now I want to talk about some modern day campaigns and things that we can look at. that actually are working on trying to improve farm worker conditions for people. The first one, this is like probably by far one of the most successful food justice campaigns in this country, is the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers food program, and basically they're migrant tomato pickers in Florida that was just experiencing all kinds of wage theft and sexual abuse and like slavery and things like that. So they organize this or what they call the Fair Food Program. This is their logo. You can actually see them, like Whole Foods and stuff are starting to carry their products. Please buy this if you see the stuff. And basically what they did was they got through like they did like a decade long boycott campaign where they got all these major international companies like Walmart and Chipotle, Trader Joe's, all these people to agree to this Fair Food Program, which basically said that if any farmer was abusing the workers or stealing their wages or things like that, that they were going to stop buying from that farm. And at the same time, they were going to pay like, I think it was like an extra penny a pound for tomatoes that had to go to the workers, which adds up, and it's significantly have increased the well-being and livelihoods of these farmers in Florida. It's a fantastic program. There are a couple holdouts though, like Wendy's. If you ever see this organization called DC Fair Food, is the local one, where if you ever see them out boycotting Wendy's, that's what they're doing, because Wendy's refuses to sign on this program. And then Publix, which is like a Southern grocery store, refuses to. So please don't shop at either one of those if possible. And then these programs, I don't have to talk about too much. I mean, this one's already over, but this was like Ben and Jerry's got all their milk from these Vermont dairy farms that were just treating their workers pretty awful. So they did a huge campaign, and it took about 7 or 8 years, but they finally got Ben and Jerry's to sign on to a similar program, like Fair Food, but like milk with dignity. So this is actually a successful campaign that's actually worked out, and the dairy farmers, migrant dairy farmers up in Vermont are enjoying a lot better conditions and a lot better pay because of this. Same with Driscoll. I don't know if you remember, there was a boycott of Driscoll berries from a while ago. Same thing, that the migrant workers were being treated horribly. They organized. They did this massive boycott for several years. Eventually, what's great about this is not only did they get better wages, but the first thing they asked for was a union, so they were allowed to unionize. There's not too many berry pickers that are unionized, and with that union they were able to collectively bargain for living wages and living conditions and all different kinds of things. So these campaigns like do work for sure. And there's a lot of international campaigns I want to talk about as well. Just kind of things to like keep an eye out for, like if you're a shrimp fan, definitely want to be more conscious of where you buy your shrimp or prawns, and depending on what part of the world you're at. But majority of the shrimp is harvested in Thailand, and there's enormous amount of actual like real modern day slavery, where they actually, literally they capture people and force them to work on these boats and shrimp processing factories and stuff. So it's a lot of so you want to, if you are going to eat shrimp, you want to look for some certifications like this one, the Farm Responsibly, or Monterey Bay Aquarium. They have a seafood tool to help you navigate if you want to buy seafood and don't want it to come from industries that have slavery. So just things to kind of look out for, or trying to find domestic shrimp, like from Texas or Alaska or things like that as well. So it's worth asking, if you're going to order some shrimp at a restaurant, ask where it came from. And if they don't know, then it's from Thailand, because it's super cheap. Like you advertise like Gulf shrimp, like you would advertise it if you got local shrimp, because that's actually pretty it's a little bit more expensive. Then coffee for sure. Majority of the coffee comes from Brazil. All those companies like Nescafe, Nespresso, and all them. they buy most of their coffee from Brazil and a lot of industries where there's again debt bondage, all kinds of horrific conditions. So when you're buying coffee, you want to think about better ways to better campaigns out there. Fair trade for sure. That's the easiest one. Like you see the words fair trade or these symbols. Fair trade means that there's certain third-party certifications for better human rights and environmental rights. It's not perfect. There's always somebody. There's some complaints around fair trade, but it's even bad fair trade is oftentimes at least a little better than or at least in my opinion. I'm sure some people would argue with that, but there are a lot of good fair trade too. As well. So definitely keep an eye out for fair trade. Direct trade though, that's something that's coming up new, and that's actually pretty cool because fair trade's like, hey, buy this product so you can support human rights, which is great in theory, but unfortunately, our society. I mean, they don't, that's not the number one consumer choice. And, they want taste and quality and things like that. So direct trade actually does the same thing, but through a higher quality product. So what they do is like, you'll have, like Counterculture is our a big direct trade, coffee, distributor in DC, and they'll go to these farms and they'll like teach these farms like how to get like the best coffee, which you have to kind of hand pick more. It's more labor intensive, but they created what's called specialty coffee, which is a very it's more of a high quality coffee that a lot of our coffee shops will have. It tastes better, it brews better, all that stuff, and it gets a better price. So they'll work with these companies, but at the same time they're monitoring for human rights violations and things like that as well. But they're ultimately they're getting these people a better price for their coffee, like a livable wage price. And at the same time, it's been much more successful than fair trade because people actually they're buying it because they like the taste, not because they're supporting human rights, which unfortunately that's not how we do things in society. So that's so when you do see things like direct trade or counter call, specialty coffee, things like that, single origin, a lot of times, I mean, you want to research them, you want to read them and make sure, because it's really on the company. So the company gets to decide if they want to have a human rights standard or not. Counterculture has a really great human rights standards. You can read all about it on their website. Yeah, definitely look for it. Direct trade. Do a little research on it before you buy it. But if you find a good one, it's many people will argue it's even better than fair trade because it actually brings more profits to the farmers. And then shade grown coffee, which is environmental one. It doesn't always have, it's usually, I mean, yeah, you're not going to find shade coffee at like a, Nescafe Brazilian plantation. So it's usually better human rights as well. And now we talk about another way that the things people have been doing, getting kind of getting more money and better conditions for the farmers is actually trademarks, and that is a really big case that happened in Ethiopia. So background, like Starbucks at one point they got majority of their coffee from Ethiopia. Ethiopia wins all these kind of contests of best tasting coffee. But the problem is their farmers were all in terrible poverty. Even though Starbucks was making billions probably, and they were getting next to nothing in return. So they came up with this idea of actually trademarking their coffee. And that way they can set the terms, they could set the pricing, they could set all this stuff, so they tried in 2014 and Starbucks fought them, pretty bad. But then Oxfam, all these organizations came in and really did this massive campaign to get Starbucks to let up. And eventually they got their trademarks. And not because of that, they're actually able to pull in, they could dictate their terms, their pricing, and they're actually, they've been able to bring billions and billions of extra dollars every year to their farmers because of this trademark. It's a pretty cool story. And there's a lot of industries with a lot of child labor. Most of our chocolate comes from Ivory Coast and Ghana, and you get a lot of places like Nestle and Hershey's and that claim every year to be working on it, but they never, they're not making much progress. There's a lot of child labor. Same with vanilla and Madagascar. So you want to look for fair trade if possible. Vanilla and chocolate. fair, free, bananas a great, example, like free trade bananas. There's like 5 companies that control most of it, and they, horrific, situation, abuse and wage theft and chemical exposure. So that's why it's important when you're buying bananas, look for that fair trade. Because not only does fair trade, they're supposed to guarantee, like I said, it's not perfect, but they're supposed to guarantee better working conditions and environmental conditions. But at the same time, there's a fair trade premium, which is why it costs a little bit more. And that money has to go back to the farmers, and they can use that to improve like their communities, building health clinics and schools and things like that. So there's actually a lot of fair trade products out there. So keep an eye out for fair trade as much as possible. And then Fair is Life is like this one that they kind of recognize there's some loopholes and gaps, and fair trade's not a perfect system. I believe in it. I think we should support it as much as possible, but there are some loopholes. So Fair is for Life is this like kind of like this advanced fair trade that's supposed to have better monitoring systems and things like that. So if you see this, it's just kind of like a fair trade 2.0. All right, so now we're going to get to food worker right campaigns, which DC, had one recently that we could talk a little bit about. So I want to talk about restaurant workers. So restaurant workers is a huge industry in this country. 11 million, food workers is one of the fastest growing industries. 1 out of 10 people are employed by restaurants. And DC, there's no exceptions. DC, we have a huge restaurant industry. Unfortunately, I mean, there are people that make a lot of money in restaurant industries, but overall, there's a lot of poverty in restaurants. Bureau of Labor does this like top 10, most impoverished jobs or industries, and every year restaurant workers get 7 out of 10 of those positions. Like different, like whether it's dish cooks, line cooks, dishwashers, whatever. So there's enormous amount of poverty that's coming from the restaurant industry. If you're a restaurant worker, you're 3 times more likely to fall below the poverty line, 2 times more likely to use food stamps, and vast majority of restaurant workers lack paid sick days, which we can see with this, like, with a pandemic, like, it's pretty important. Like, these are people serving us food, and if they can't take a day off when they're sick, that means they're serving us food while they're sick. And so it's pretty horrific. At the same time, there's an enormous amount of racial discrimination, enormous amount of if you're a white male worker, you're more likely to get the high-end paying jobs, you're more likely to get paid more, you're more likely to get the better jobs. And then at the top of that, there's a lot of harassment as well, particularly with restaurants that that use what we call a tip wage, a tip sub minimum wage. And there's been a lot of confusion around this. Like, a lot of people will claim that tips cause harassment, and that's not true. What happens is like, there's when you're a server who's trying to are worried about paying your rent that day, and then all of a sudden you got this like customer or coworker that's harassing you, and you're forced to kind of be harassed so you can make it to that tip, so you can pay your wages, so you can you can pay your hospital bills because you don't have health insurance, so you can pay your rent. So you're forced into these situations. So what tipping does is it gives more power to the harassers in many situations. So that's why there's been a lot of campaigns to remove what's called the tip sub minimum wage. So what the tip sub minimum wage is basically, there's 2 minimum wages out there. There's one standard one for most industries, and then there's all these exceptions. Whether like if you're like like if you're I'm just I'm gonna leave that thought because I can't think of it. But one of the exceptions is a tip someone if you're a tip worker, because the idea is that you don't have to pay the full, like, if your minimum wage is $8 an hour, you can only, tip workers only get $2 an hour, and with that thought that tips would actually, make up the difference. And then there's a thing called tip credit, where if it doesn't make up the difference, the restaurants are supposed to like pay you more to make up that difference. And that's where an enormous amount of wage theft happens, because if you don't make that difference, it's basically an honor system with these restaurants, and that's where like majority of theft happens, is wage theft. And it's just a huge loophole, where they get away with like billions of dollars of wage theft during the by not making up that tip credit. And you can report them; it's against the law. But the thing is, if you report them, they're going to know who reported you, and they're going to, you're going to lose your job. You're going to be discriminated against. That's why a lot of people don't report it, like especially if you're undocumented, or if you're worried about paying rent, you're not going to report that stuff. So that's where a lot of it happens. And basically, that tip minimum wage, it came about after the Civil War. Tipping was this like an aristocracy thing that was happening in Europe, where they show off their wealth. But then it was brought into the U.S. after the Civil War as a way to, a lot of industries want, as a way not to pay, newly, freed black people, or newly freed enslaved people. So they can, like Pullman rail operators and all these, they're basically like, you can just, work for tips and that's it. And that was eventually outlawed because they realized that was a terrible system, that impoverished a lot of people. So they outlawed that for a while. But then they kind of brought it back, and in the 60s they created a federal tip minimum wage, which was supposed to be 50% of the minimum wage with tips, and that was supposed to rise with every time the minimum wage rose, the tip minimum wage was supposed to rise. But then this guy named Herman Cain came about, the pizza guy. He was the head of the National Restaurant Association, and he worked to decouple that, and he basically in the mid 1990s he froze the tip minimum wage to $2.13, which I believe is what the current, tip minimum wage. So even though the federal minimum wage kept on going up barely, but that stayed frozen. And that 20 states use that as their tip sub minimum wage. 22 other states added a little bit. Each state can decide. Like DC is like 333, but then like 7 states decided they just want to get rid of the tip minimum wage altogether, because there's just such a huge loophole for wage theft, and all different kinds of other things. So they eliminated, you could still tip, for sure, but they guaranteed that all restaurants had to pay the state minimum wage to all their workers. Like you could find studies to back whatever viewpoint you believe in, but the majority of the studies I've read have found a lot of positive coming out of this. Because it's hard, because it's like we keep on wanting to pay our workers more, but oftentimes if you pay your workers more, that money's got to go somewhere. So oftentimes like your prices have to increase, or something similar to that. And if you're just doing that out of the good of your heart, and everyone else is exploiting their workers, you're going to go out of business. But if everyone has to do that, everyone has to meet the new minimum wage, there's a better chance to create a more positive, economy where not only are people paid better, but they can actually reinvest that money. The people that invest the most in our economy are the poor people and lower middle class, because they spend all their money instead of like saving it away, and the rich with our trickle down economics. So it found a lot of positives coming from this. So the other states have been trying to do the similar ones. We tried to do it in DC, actually, with what's called Initiative 77. If everyone remembers that, it was a very passionate debates and stuff, and I'm sure depending on whether where you work, you might have your opinion on that. But essentially it passed. There was a lot of accusations about it wasn't worded really well in the ballot, so there was a lot of accusations about what did that confuse. that. So, but eventually, the other side, the Save Our Tips, side, that was sponsored by the National Restaurant Association, was able to convince our council to overturn that referendum. So they did. They overturned the referendum, or and that never passed. And at the same time, there was like, they promised to do all these things, to have like, better funding for sexual harassment and wage theft. I'm not sure. I have not seen them fund any of that. I know for a while, this is pre-COVID. Everyone was like, when are you going to do this? And so I'm not really sure if that ever got funded or not. But it's important to understand, whether you're for this or against this, it's important to understand just like the context of what this is. And you have to understand that this organization called the National Restaurant Association, they call it the other NRA. Their purpose is to create as much profit as possible for restaurants. So they do this by fighting, well, they do this a whole variety of different things. But one of the things they do is they create public campaigns and advocate against things like minimum wage increases, sick day benefits, public health measures, wage theft protections, things like that. And oftentimes they start what's called these AstroTurf campaigns. So AstroTurf is like this like fake grassroots movement, like kind of like the Tea Party movement, where the people were real, people, it wasn't like they were all paid, but they were pumped full of like false information by these fake, organizations. Like our AstroTurf was called Save Our Tips. You go to their website and it doesn't say who paid for this or operating this. It just blurts out all these like crazy facts, like everyone's all the whole entire restaurant industry is going to fall under if we pass this minimum wage increase. So it pumped people, oftentimes people who are like barely making rent or have a lot of legitimate worries, and they pump them full of a lot of like I don't even know, false information or worst case scenario, whatever. But and that creates this whole movement that it feels grassroots, but it's really being funded and pushed by corporate interests. And so that that did so that was they've done this all over the country. They do this anytime, like they've done this in New York and Vermont. Anytime there's organizations trying to pass like health benefits or minimum wage increases in restaurants, they do these AstroTurfs. I'm gonna read this by Stephen Rosenfield. He writes, in June, the NRA boasted that its lobbyists had stopped minimum wage increases in 27 out of 29 states in 2013. In Connecticut, which increased the state minimum wage, a raise in the base pay for tip workers such as waitress and bartenders vanished in the final bill. A similar scenario unfolded in New York State. It increased its minimum wage, but the NRA last-minute lobbying derailed raising the pre-tip wage at restaurants and bars. The deals came despite polls showing 80% support for the raising minimum wage. The NRA's lobbying didn't stop there. It also told members that it blocked a dozen states this year from passing laws that would require earned paid sick leave, which is what New York City and Portland and Oregon adopted. Meanwhile, it boasted that 6 states, including Florida, passed NRA-backed laws that preemptively ban localities from granting earned and paid employee sick time. So that's important to understand, because this what happened in DC wasn't like a unique thing. And I know there's like nuances and stuff, like especially when DC, like our restaurants are more locally owned instead of like Los Angeles, where it's probably more corporate restaurants that can afford to pay more. So there's a lot of nuances. So so I'm not an expert on this, but it's important to understand that this wasn't just a one-off thing. This is like a part of a decade long, for many decades, the NRA has been working on stopping even bills that passed. Like in New York, they passed the minimum wage increase, but then NRA worked behind the scenes to get their council to drop it. Just like very similar to what happened in DC. So that's important to understand, that why our restaurant industry is creates some of the most impoverished jobs in this country, and it has a lot. It's very intentional. It's not so that's basically okay. That's what I'm saying. There's some really great sources if you want to read more about some of this. And then I got, if anyone works in the restaurant industry, just want to make sure you're aware of your laws and about organizing and things like that. And all right, so now we're gonna move. See how much time. Oh, so probably only have enough time for one more section. I might just go ahead, because we're recording it. I'll go ahead and do the the entire class, but just for those, yeah, it's 8:20 now, so feel free, jump off when you need to, but and I'll just finish recording the rest of this. But we don't have too much left to go. But the next section we're going to talk about is environmental injustice. We're going to talk about how our food systems affect our environment. One thing I want to start off just talking about the idea of organic. I think most people understand that organic is better. We don't want to use these pesticides. The Green Revolution, in many ways, was wrong about pesticides, and it's actually been killing our planet. So we want to get back to organic. But the problem with organic is it can be really hard to get. It's not an easy certification. If you want to get USDA organic, that's how most people that are USDA organic are large scale industrial agricultural centers, because you got to have a lot of money to pay the admin fees, to do all the paperwork, to do all the verifications and stuff. If you're a small scale farmer, it's just not possible. So that's why they created this other certification that's almost identical to USDA organic, but on the levels of herbicides and fertilizers and stuff. But it's much cheaper. It's more local, and it's really for small scale farms. It's called certified natural grown. How they make it cheaper is they actually they recruit your neighbors will be your monitors. So if you're going to apply for it, and the farm close by has it already, they'll get recruited to come and to verify all the standards on you, instead of paying to bring in USDA folks and doing all these processes and stuff. So it's actually a very simple process. It's very easy. It's very not very expensive, but it's almost exactly the same standards. So if you see this as certified natural grown, not only can you rely that this is organic, but you also it's more likely to be local and small scale farms. As of course, USDA is more likely to be large scale on the other side of the country. But there's also other places finding your local farms, local harvest, amazing grazing. If you want, that's the best thing you could do is just find a local farm, even go visit it and check it out and make sure it meets your standards. And making that local connection. It's one good thing that's coming out of this pandemic is, for a while, watching on the news, watching thousands of pounds of produce, millions, being tilled in because the distribution network all collapsed because all the restaurants and stuff closed. At the same time, we're watching, miles and miles of cars lined up, to the food banks. It's really showed just how fragile and terrible our food system has been. And it's really pushed a lot of people to try to find more local food systems and more local connections. It's hard to get on the CSA right now, because all the CSAs and all the local farms are full right now. People are really, I realize the importance of having local food systems. Another thing I want to talk about is palm oil. This is in all kinds of things, all different kinds. It's basically an oil that stays solid while at room temperature. So that's why it's so important, and it's very efficient. I mean, it's a big berry that gets a lot of oil out of it. Unfortunately, a lot of palm oil industries are pretty horrific. They deforest the area. They're killing a lot of habitats, using a lot of child labor and enslaved labor. But there is a better solution. There is a whole movement to try to make more sustainable, palm oil. And there's this is the biggest one I've seen so far, the RSPO, the Certified Sustainable Palm Oil. And basically, they work with these palm oil because you don't want to just stop. I mean, you can, but I mean, the problem is they just stop buying. I know friends that are working in sustainable palm oil, and they're like, you can't, millions of people's livelihoods is connected to palm oil. So it's not, it's just, you can't just stop it. We need to provide sustainable industries that actually work on reforesting, work with local populations, what have, human rights standards and environmental standards. So definitely keep an eye out for the certification. The first time I saw it was on a Girl Scout cookie. They do partial ones. Sometimes they do mix if they can't, find enough for the whole product. But definitely keep an eye out for this when it's shopping. And then GMOs and Monsanto. So Monsanto is basically is this company, it's a company that basically came out of the ashes of the Green Revolution, and was basically was on board, was creating all these we call GMO genetically modified organisms, creating these new seeds and stuff that basically like corn and rice and wheat, where you can it would be tolerant to pesticides that they created, so like Roundup pesticide, so that way they can grow a whole field of corn, and then you could just cover, spray the whole field with this Roundup, herbicide, and then everything but your corn will die, because you have that, that resistant gene in these seeds that they're selling. But the problem was, I mean, like as we're saying, it's like you're spraying all these pesticides, it's polluting, killing the soil, you're creating monocultural systems that are that lack diversity, destroying these monocultural sustainable systems, and these seeds are they lose resistance over time. So you have to buy new ones, and you have to buy more herbs and pesticides, and it's thrown all these farmers, small farmers, into debt all over the world, and it's a tough system. So at the same time, Bayer bought, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, bought Monsanto 2 years ago. So now like they're just consolidating more and more onto these seeds. At the same time, they're like, patenting all this stuff and forcing people to use herbicides. So it's yeah, you kind of want to, yeah, a lot of people, there's a whole movement to kind of stay away from GMOs. So GMOs, there's been legislation to pass on GMO legislation. 64 countries around the world that's passed that, where they label it, because that's the problem, is you don't know what product has GMO, in it or not, because they don't, as of right now, they don't have to label it as stuff, but all these other countries are saying, no, if you're using GMO products, you got to label it, these products. So we in 2017 we passed a national GMO labeling law. It's just been like it keeps on being pushed back though, but supposedly January 1st 2020 or 22, they're gonna implement the final like law regulations where companies are going to have to start disclosing that they use GMOs or not. There are a bunch of loopholes around it and stuff, but hopefully we'll see how. I mean, they're still working on final regs, so we'll see how that goes. And then, yeah, seafood. Here's some really great guides: Monterey Bay Aquarium seafood guides to like local seafood. If you're looking for, like best choices, if you want, more sustainable ones that, good alternatives. And Void, they have different packets for any, where, any part of the country and stuff. And they have a sushi one and stuff. So if you still want to eat seafood and you want to do, find the best choices possible, definitely check out Monterey Bay Aquarium, because we are definitely overfishing, and just not only is that bad for our ecosystems, but it's also bad for climate change, because the ocean, the ecosystems in the ocean is a huge carbon store, and we're basically destroying these ecosystems by overfishing. So we definitely if you can't, yeah, best choice to give up fish, but if you're not going to give up fish, find the right choices, the most sustainable choices to do. And then I want to talk about environmental racism in our food system as well. So this goes along with environmental injustice. So environmental racism is so I'm gonna read this definition by Dr. Robert Bollert. Writes, environmental racism is any environmental policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individual groups or communities based on race or color. Low-income persons and people of color are exposed to greater environmental risks than white or affluent communities. And you see this across the country, where you see, the communities that are stuck next to, mines or power plants or trash burning plants, incinerating plants, or polluted areas are usually communities of color. And that has to do with a long history of redlining and housing discrimination. But we are seeing this a lot in the food systems too. For example, like the pig industry. If you eat pork, unless there's some good pork farms up in this area, locally ones, but most of them are come from North Carolina, and they have these massive, pig industries, where they're just stuffing thousands of pigs in these like small compartments, and then they just suck off all the sewage, and they have these lagoons of sewage. But when the lagoons get full, they literally just spray it into the air and let it fall. It's basically raining pig poop all over the area. And unfortunately, like a lot of these farms were built next to these like these low these poor communities of color. And they, it's tragic because they don't, their property value just plummeted, as soon as this stuff came up. They can't sell their house, they can't move, and they're all just getting horrifically sick from these pig industries. So it's, yeah. If you eat pork and you care, definitely don't. Yeah, if you can't give it up, try to find local sources. There's some really great local sources. Like there's one called like Eco Farms, where like it's a bunch of vegans that started a pork industry because they wanted like a more humane, like they let them run around the forest because that's where pigs are supposed to hang out in the forest. That's their natural habitat, and they give them like Reiki before they slaughter them and stuff. They're still getting slaughtered, but they're like it's much better. It's a pretty great place, and they'll deliver it straight to your door. But like if you don't know where the pork is coming from, it's probably coming from North Carolina, and chances are it's probably like raining crap on local poor communities. So and same with like a lot of our industries, throughout the world, a lot of these industries like the palm oil and coffee and meat industry, like most of our meat, comes, from like South America, comes from like, where they burn down a bunch of rainforests and they do what's called tropical meat. And there's a lot of indigenous communities are fighting against this because there's a lot of, pollution and slavery and things like that happening with these industries. Fortunately, unfortunately, I mean, they're getting, they're getting killed. Like a lot of these environmental activists are being murdered by these industries that can hire paramilitary to like terrorize local government, communities, and particularly indigenous communities. So that's something it's important to understand. Like, a lot of this stuff, palm oil, beef, coffee, is directly feeding into these horrific situations right now. So again, it's so important to understand like where exactly your food is coming from and how you're, a part of these systems. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is like animal agriculture and just like the environmental impact of animal agriculture. I think we're starting to really realize just how impactful, from, how much methane it produces, how much water consumption. Majority of the food that we grow in this world is grown to feed, our animal agriculture, animal agriculture. And that's the problem. It's like, they're discussing this stuff on NPR today, and they're like, well, if we got rid of pastures and cows and stuff, it wouldn't be that big of a difference for land access. And they always leave out the notion that we grow an insane amount of food that could feed the world, but instead we give it to we feed it into the animal agricultural system. And that's like that's gonna be up to like 3 pounds up to 20 pounds of corn will go into like 1 pound of meat, along with majority of our water goes to this animal agricultural system. At the same time, animal agriculture is the leading source of species extinctions, of degradation, of all different kinds of things. So definitely something to think about. And this is a really fantastic chart. It talks about greenhouse gas emissions and just and just looking at how, it's pretty clear what's like really, what's producing an enormous amount of pollution versus what's not. So just something to be aware of. And the last thing I want to talk about on this section is there's been this push for this idea called regenerative agriculture, which is really fantastic. I'm a big supporter of regenerative agriculture. it's basically, it does what's called carbon sequestration, which it basically through it's a way to capture CO2, that greenhouse gases that's warming up the climate, and it's able to actually capture it and store it into the soil. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, from reforestation projects, from stopping overfishing our oceans, to carbon farming, to all these different things. But a really great way to do it is regenerative agriculture, which is basically just trying to do, very intentional, sustainable agriculture that really focuses on, building the really healthy soil. And a lot of times they do use, they'll use, cows and things, and they'll use pasture animals, and if they rotate them right, they'll be able to, it really helps to kind of build up the soils and build up all this, and help with the carbon sequestration. And it's a really amazing practice. But there's always this debate on, like, should we eat less meat, or should we eat, regenerative agriculture meat? And in my answer is both. Like, we need to do both. We significantly need to eat less meat, but we also, the meat that, if we're still not going to give up meat, which majority of people in this country are not going to give up meat, then we need to think about, better ways to where, finding these better regenerative agricultural systems and things like that. So just wanted to kind of throw out some more some information on that. Okay. All right. So our last section, and it's 8:37. So like I said, I'm just going to keep on going just so I can finish the recording. I won't be offended if people are, this is a lot of talking and a lot of topics. Sorry, I told you it was going to be like kind of a crash course into all different kinds of things on food justice. But so if you need to go, great, but probably about another 15 minutes to wrap up. The last section I'm going to talk about is just animal welfare. This is definitely this is definitely a cause of industrial agricultural system. I mean, it's definitely animals that definitely suffer just as much as workers in the environment. So our factory farm, majority of our countries runs on factory farms, over 90%. I mean, we do have these regenerative agricultural systems and these pasture raised and grass fed systems, but they make up a very small percentage at this point. And it's important to support it. It'd be great, if we support it more, but at the same time, it's the vast majority of our animal agriculture, like something like 55 billion animals that are slaughtered every year, live in pretty horrific factory conditions. And I'm not going to go through all these. You definitely can read them yourself. But definitely something. Yeah. So this is where most of our meat is coming from. So. So we actually worked with this bunch of local advocates. We created this organization called Humane DC to try to track down higher levels of animal welfare throughout the city, different products and stuff. We tried to make a hierarchy because everyone's at a different spot. Not everyone's ready to go vegan, but everyone at least a point can start looking for better, higher quality products if possible. And these don't have to come from Whole Foods. And we found all different kinds of good things from like Safeway and things like that. You just have to kind of look at what you're looking for. So we created this hierarchy. So I'm just going to run through this hierarchy real quick just to kind of show you, ideas. It'd be great if the world was vegan, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So we definitely want to, if you're not going to go vegan, try to find the best possible answer. But if you're thinking about vegan, this is an amazing time to be vegan. We have amazing vegan restaurants all over DC, all different kinds of options, all over, like Happy Cow. You go map out anywhere in the world you're at, you can find all kinds of really amazing vegan recipes and options. You do need to be worried a little bit about your vegan nutrition, like B15, like 2 vitamins in particular, B12 and B and vitamin D. Those you can get a lot of those from meat and dairy. But if you're not eating meat and dairy, you want to think about either taking a supplement or trying to eat a lot of mushrooms or nutritional yeast or things like that. Lots of different vegan options and things like that. Only thing is, like, don't feed your dog and cat are carnivores, so don't feed them vegan, but you can find like Open Farm, they actually the meat comes from more humanely raised products, and some people argue with the word humane because they're still being slaughtered and stuff, but there is a significant difference between raising chickens in that factory and raising them outdoors, so on a pasture. So if you are, if you have cats and dogs and you want to, it's pretty easy to find this open farm product. um Recover food for sure. I know a lot of people that only eat meat if they can recover it, from your dumpster diving or picking up, food that would normally be tossed. So definitely, we started an organization, a working group called DC Food Recovery Working Group. It's got all different, if you're looking for ways to recover food in DC, check that out. And then there's vegetarian and reductionary options. Reductionary is the idea of like, I'm not going to stop eating meat, but I recognize I need to eat less meat. So trying to find, and that goes kind of hand in hand because a lot of times these higher animal welfare certifications are more expensive, but if you're eating less meat, the hope is it kind of balances out. But the best thing you could do is find your local farms that they're pasture raised, grass fed, that's local. You can actually go out to these farms and see for yourself, they're not hiding anything. A lot of these times, you can buy, they have stores on their farms. A lot of these places will deliver straight to your door. So definitely check out like humanedc.org. We mapped out all the places that will like literally deliver, stuff like this is from Eco Farms. It will literally, deliver their pork straight to your door. It is more costly for sure, and I think it's important not to shame people who can't afford it because we're all at a certain level. That's why we made that hierarchy. So if you can afford, you find what you can afford and do what you can. But if you can't afford this, this is a pretty great way. There's a lot of amazing pasture raised farms in the area. Visiting, farms, here's a whole list of things to look for if you go visit. I don't need to, it's pretty late to talk about animal mutilation, so I don't need to get in that, but definitely you can use this list if you're going to do it, visits. And then if you don't have time or a car and you can't visit, there's a lot of products you can pick up at grocery stores that have what's called animal welfare certifications. Some are better than others. Like the best one out there is this animal welfare approved. They got amazing standards. Then there's like these global animal partnerships that has like 5+ through 1. So if you get 5, you try to get the highest number. Whole Foods has this, but they always have just 1 or 2, which isn't that great. It's still better than factory farm, but certified humane is all right. Has some issues. And then like even like US organic and certified naturally grown, they have some animal certifications. It came real close. We tried to get Obama to pass better ones. He kind of did, but then Trump overturned it. Yeah, these are great. These are better than nothing, but they're not, there's some issues with these bottom ones. This is that global animal partnership one. So, you can see like the different standards. So you want to shoot for like 4 to 5, in the green area. But again, like, even step 1 and 2 is better than factory farms. Even if it's just a small step, better. Yeah. And then like, there's all this terminology like cage free and free range and all that stuff. And a lot of it doesn't mean a whole lot, to be honest. Like cage free, like, so most chickens, they have what's called battery cages, factory farms where you never get to move, all their lives. It's pretty horrific existence. But then like, this is cage free. That doesn't look, that much better. So if it just says cage free and there's no certifications, it's not a whole lot. Like free range, it's not, free range. Sometimes they allow them outdoor. Free range can literally mean they opened up a door, but if the chickens are too sick to even walk out, that's still considered free range. You basically want to look for like pasture raised, or some organic or some kind of certification when you're looking for the words. Yeah, if someone says cage free, it may be better than getting something that 100% know is factory farm, but there's not a whole lot behind that. Then there's a lot of great products that are certified organic and pasture raised. These are the two best ones. You can find these in any grocery store. Organic Valley and Stonyfield. They're all worker co-ops that have pretty high standards around pasture raised products. Pasture raised means that they actually get to be raised in their national habitat. Grass fed means they actually get to be raised and outdoors in the field as opposed to inside the factory farm. And and then we say 100% grass fed because a lot of times they'll raise cows on a pasture for a while, but then they send them to this they're called like CAFOs or something, that there's high density feed lots where the last month of their life they're in a pretty horrific condition, being force fed, and kind of fatten them up right before the slaughter. So so when you see 100% grass fed, that means that they stay on their pasture their whole entire life. So definitely, yeah, check out. I mean, it's a little outdated. We haven't updated in a couple of years, but you could find plenty of options on all of those options on humanedc.org. So definitely check that out. And if anyone's like interested in helping me update this website, yeah, please reach out. And then also a lot of times, the grocery stores, they don't have products because no one's asked for them. So ASPCA, it's a animal rights organization, actually created this great supermarket request letter where you can actually say, hey, I would love it if you start carrying Stonyfield yogurt or like animal welfare products or something. So a lot of times it's just about asking them, and yeah, you'd be surprised, I mean, especially if they recognize you, if they've seen you before in these stores, they know you're a repeat customer, they're gonna yeah, sometimes it's pretty easy getting them to start carrying these products. Which is like the last part of the responsible consumerism. It's just an idea of taking time, going to a grocery store and really mapping out and finding spend a couple hours one day just like looking at all your options and finding out the best options, what's in your budget, what's not in your budget, and just taking the time to make a plan at your grocery, and also finding out what they're missing and taking the time to like send them letters, petitions, things like that, to start getting them to actually carry better, more responsible products. And this is a really great program that is launched. I think it was launched in Oakland, but DC is now DCPS schools are actually launching it. It's called the Good Food Purchasing Program, where they actually look at they analyze their institutions like schools, and they see where all the food's coming in, and they try and map out better options for all the foods, based on these 5, whether it's animal welfare, nutrition, workforce, local, environmental, sustainable. And so it's like this guide, is that kind of helps institutions, purchase better, better high quality products and for their local institutions. So DCPS is actually in the process of doing this. DCPS is DC, public schools, which is super exciting. They've been partnering, like DC Greens has kind of been pushing this, and they actually got some legislation to do this for the schools. And hopefully, if it goes well with the schools, they'll start doing this with all of our institutions in DC. And it's a really great way, like, because the institution, I mean, we have huge purchasing power with our schools. So if our schools all of a sudden be like, I want, I want to buy food from, farmers that actually have, are treated well, or I want to buy local, or I want to buy, high animal welfare, like that has power in our system. So definitely excited that we're finally doing this in DC, and I'm excited to see where they take this. And that's basically it. I wrote a whole bunch of resources down here on more books and stuff around food justice, different local food justice organizations. But like I said, tomorrow we're going to really dive into, or not tomorrow, next week, we're going to dive into more local, like what's happening on the local, a little bit local history and local, initiatives and things. Next class is more about what we can do, about things and how we can get involved. And also I talked a lot about history. So a bunch of us started this organization called People's School of DC, where we create a lot of resources. It's kind of like a social justice hub for DC. Like if you want to find different organizations to work with, like, if you want to work with homelessness or you want to work with immigration reform, you can find the organizations in this area and find the events, and there's a lot of great resources. But we do like I said, I used to be a teacher, high school teacher or history teacher, and I do I'm slowly recording a lot of these history classes, like a lot of histories that we talked about today. Like if you want to learn more about colonialism, how that came about, and capitalism, early histories, and how things that we've founded. I'm in the process. This was an ambitious timeline during COVID, but I've got about half of these recorded. So if you're interested in learning more, and you can watch on your own time, definitely, like I said, this is the first step of the decolonization, is really understanding our real history. So definitely check that out. And yeah, that's basically it. Sorry, that was a lot. I just feel a little bad, but thank you all so much for making it through. Definitely, I'll stick around for a little bit if anyone has any questions, but if not, yeah, y'all are great. See you next week.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was so much material, and it was really, really incredible. It was really, really well and thoroughly researched too. So truly, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
So,
Very interesting,
thank you.
very motivating.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and shut down. Thank you all.